This is the ETM Course Podcast. Welcome back to the ETM Podcast. This is a very special episode and something I've been wanting to do for a long time. The standard of pre-hospital or out-of-hospital trauma care in Australia and New Zealand is world-class, which is all the more impressive due to our relatively small population and the huge variation in population density spread across such a large landmass. In this episode of the podcast, I'm going to play the recording of the inaugural ETM webinar on pre-hospital trauma that we hosted last week, starring several luminaries in this field. Over the years, I've been lucky enough to meet and work with several of the leaders in pre-hospital trauma care in Australia and New Zealand, both through the ETM course and also working myself as a medical retrieval consultant in the Northern Territory. And in doing so, one can't help but develop a short list of people who you would be happy to have pull you out of a wreck, resuscitate you and transport you to hospital should you ever have the misfortune to need that. And all of my guests on this webinar are on my list, including Dave Tingey from Adelaide, Sam Bendall and Libby Hanrahan from Sydney, Paul Reeves from the NT and Gary Berkowitz from Queensland. There aren't enough words to describe the depth and breadth of experience of this group, who between them have over a century of real-world pre-hospital clinical experience, spanning niches from austere environments in developing countries and military zones, search and rescue, urban, regional and remote retrieval, tactical work with police, inner-city rapid response teams, and the full range of assets from road to rotary wing to fixed wing and jets. We cover a range of topics in this episode, including notification and preparation and travel to the trauma scene and patient assessment, critical care in the air and what's changed over the last decade in pre-hospital trauma management, and differences between short and long-distance trauma transports in Australia. There was just so much to talk about. This episode goes for just over an hour and a half, but it's chock full of pearls, so let's get into it. This is the inaugural ETM webinar on pre-hospital trauma. We've picked a few topics that I think cover a bit of a broad spectrum of pre-hospital trauma, and we're going to start with that initial notification, or when you're working your pre-hospital job, the alarm goes off, the phone rings, the buzzer goes, and you get told, hey, there's a trauma case, you've been notified. How do you prepare, and what do you think about when you're traveling to the scene? So I'm going to get Dave Tingey to speak to that first. Dave, maybe if you want to quickly introduce yourself, say hi, and tell us about what you think about when you get those first few bits of description about a trauma job that you're getting sent to.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. My name's Dave Tingey, and I'm a critical care paramedic practitioner with SAS MedStar based in Adelaide, South Australia. I've been a paramedic for 34 years. So Andy's asked me to talk about the initial notification and preparation approach to the scene. So I'll skim over some of those, and then Andy, if you want to tease out any of that, just ask me. So our service responds via a variety of transport means. We do road response in a rapid response vehicle in the metro and surrounding sort of inner hills and rural areas. We have a helicopter response, and we also have a fixed wing response, which in the setting of trauma is almost entirely for inter-hospital transfers or secondary transfers of trauma patients. So our notification system comes through a state coordination centre, and we have two methods in which that might occur. The first is a rapid response within what we call our rapid response zone, which is an automatic response via the communication system, and pager goes off and says you're going, and you get in your helicopter or vehicle when you drive. The second one is for those further out, and our service covers the entirety of South Australia, and so could be an hour, hour and a half, sometimes 2-hour flight to get to a trauma patient in a rural facility, in which case there would be a slower activation with discussions with our coordinating consultant around specific requirements, often based on the capabilities of the rural health facility that we're going to. The other consideration is that our ambulance service across the state is a mixture of paid and volunteer ambulance officers and paramedics, and so the area that we are responding to would determine what we would likely see and have to do when we get there. So we may have a patient who is completely appropriately treated, managed, packaged, ready for transport. We may have a patient who's been managed at a BLS level by volunteers who may not even have a drip in them at that stage. And so that would factor into our planning as well.
And
as
Dave,
far as
how much
go ahead.
how much information do you get about that en route? Do you tend to get sort of updates and things on the way, or you just sometimes just arrive and figure it out when you get there?
Yeah, so one of the tools we use is that we ensure that at least one of our radios is switched to the local radio channel or talk group, so we can hear the sit reps given directly from the scene. But probably as important as the information that comes out of the sit reps is that we can actually hear the tone in the people's voices, and that often gives us an indication of how well they're coping. Whether the scene sounds like it's under control or not. Yeah. So in terms of pre-departure preparation, and I'm just going to try and share my screen, Andy. So we have a tool available to us, which is a pre-departure checklist, which allows us to do a 30-second team check before we leave the base to ensure that we've prepared ourselves appropriately. And that covers things such as self and buddy check. So how's our fatigue, hydration, comfort? Do we have our appropriate PPE, both for flight and for scene response? Communications, do we need to consider additional drugs or blood products or pediatric calculator if we know we're going to kids? Do we need to consider additional equipment or specialty packs? Any advanced life support, such as, well, not specific to trauma, but could be balloon pump, ECMO, or nitric, for example. And if it sounds like it's a multi-patient incident, then what extras might we want to take? Do we need extra monitoring or ventilators? Do we need extra drugs or packaging equipment? So that's up on the wall on posters at every exit to our building, and it allows the team to stop for 30 seconds and just do that final kind of check before we commit ourselves to actually leaving a place where we can be more prepared. So I might tease out some of those points that we talked about just then. So in terms of extra equipment, particularly for multi-casualty incidents, we might need to consider whether we need additional triage equipment to supplement what the ambulance crews would have at scene, whether we need any extra packaging equipment, such as extra vacuum mattresses. Do we need to think about reconfiguring the helicopter for multi-patient transport? Blood and blood products. So we routinely carry 4 units of INEG red cells for every primary response, but we could supplement that in a number of different ways, again, depending on the acuity and the time pressures of response. So if it's a scene response, then we would probably take what we have. If it's a further distance other than our sort of typical maybe up to an hour helicopter response or road response, we might consider taking some extended blood products. On base, we have fibrinogen concentrate. We also have an ISTAT, so it gives us the ability to do blood gases and electrolytes and so on. But if we're doing an inter-hospital trauma retrieval from a remote health facility, for example, then we have the ability to, time permitting, to pick up a massive transfusion pack from one of our tertiary centres and take that with us.
Can you maybe talk to that
extended journey
quickly, Dave, just about the logistics of doing that? Because that is an option for a lot of services around the country, but it does have this bit of a time lag and things. You have to physically send some staff in a vehicle down to the hospital, to like the tertiary hospital, and pick it up and then get back to base in Adelaide. Or
Yeah, so we have a number of different ways, and it depends largely on how we're actually responding. So typically it would be either helicopter or fixed wing. We don't tend to use MTP for trauma response in the sort of road response areas because of the proximity to the trauma centres. And so the options would be, if we're going by helicopter, we have a process in place with one of our major trauma centres where we can land on the helipad, and by the time we land there from the airport, they'll actually have a PSA standing on the roof with an MTP, and one of our crew will jump out, grab it, and we'll fly on, so with minimal delays. If it's fixed wing, then obviously there's typically a longer response time, and so we can either get a crew, an ambulance crew or team leader that's at the trauma centre to bring the MCP to the airport, or if we have a delay, maybe because of lack of aircraft availability, we might be able to send our crew up to the trauma centre to pick it up and then get back to the airfield in time for departure. So there's a number of different options that we use.
Yeah, great. Well, that's a pretty comprehensive system, isn't it? Pretty much covers all
Yeah.
options, doesn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. We, as I said before, we do carry fibrinogen concentrate, or keep it on our base. We don't tend to use it for our shorter trauma responses simply because of the complexity and the time it takes to mix it up. And so in those sort of rapid response, rapid return to the trauma centre, we don't tend to have the time to physically draw it up and administer it.
It's a bit of mucking around,
like,
isn't it, with the
it is,
vials
yeah,
and the shaking and not foaming it up.
yeah, that's it. Don't shake. Yeah.
If anyone hasn't mixed up the fibrinogen concentrate before, it's like a protein powder. It's like a protein shake, and if you shake it while you're mixing it, it just turns into froth. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Difficult to administer.
And the other things that we would consider pre-departure would be our own safety and our teammates' safety, and that includes PPE, which I mentioned before. So whether we've got all of our appropriate flight equipment for the helicopter, plus scene safety equipment, we will often arrive when the patient's still trapped, and so may have to work in the vicinity of the extrication process. So having the appropriate equipment to protect us in that environment. We do a lot of flights over water, and so depending on the time of year, if it's cold in winter, then we would wear survival suits for some of our over water trips, and so that adds a little bit of time, but obviously a fair bit of extra protection for us should something happen to the aircraft. And then the other thing that we always brief, and I think especially important for newer staff as they rotate through our service, is a reminder for them to go through their Hewitt drills or their helicopter underwater escape training drills if we're preparing to go over water, so that it's front of mind before we actually get into a situation where we might need it.
Yeah, it's a lot to remember, isn't it? That's
Yeah.
Shows you why. I mean, I'm super impressed by MedStar's training facility in Adelaide, and several other services have sort of cottoned onto this now. I think you guys really probably led the way about that, the need for this continuous training and update, and going through your Hewitt drills, also the clinical things you need to practice. So when you're going out the door, you've had a bit of recent exposure because there's so many things to remember. And Dave, I guess you mentioned safety. There's something else I think about as well, is just, and we're going to talk in detail about scene stuff soon, but about the type of jobs. I mean, there's been some unfortunate incidents related to firearms that I think one of the life flight crews in Queensland got sent out to a while back when some police officers got shot, and the nature of the traumatic incidents, assaults and that sort of thing. And we'll touch on this maybe with some of the NT jobs where we send crews out to remote communities as well. How do you kind of mentally prepare for that, and assess whether this is going to be a safe place to actually land and actually get to the patient?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we rely heavily on the information coming out from the scene. If it's a firearms incident and there is still a active threat, then even the local crews obviously would be directed to a staging area, which is a safe distance from the incident, and none of us would be allowed to enter the scene until it's declared to be safe by the police. I think that's pretty much the written and unwritten rule everywhere that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
We're very fortunate in that our retrieval service has a rotation of rescue and retrieval paramedics from our special operations team who spend part of their time on retrieval and part of their time working in their special operations role, part of which is providing tactical medical support for our specialist police units. And so they're very familiar with the procedures and requirements for those sorts of events, and it's really useful having them. We're quite unique in that a medical retrieval team of 2 would respond to a primary response or a trauma alongside one of our rescue paramedics who is also retrieval trained. And in fact, on some days, there may also be a rescue or retrieval paramedic on the retrieval team as well. And so having those additional resources, essentially a 3-person crew that can work together from a clinical perspective, but has that extended capability in terms of the rescue logistics and tactical knowledge of the rescue paramedics, makes it probably as seamless as we could get it in terms of us moving into those environments.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive service, isn't it? Look, in the interest of time, that's amazing, Dave. It's such a great system in South Australia that you work in. You've actually, and Dave's so humble, he won't talk about himself having been a sort of such a important part of that, building that system over the last few decades. So full credit to you and all your colleagues there. It's amazing. Maybe could you just talk briefly just about those? So you've just, for example, you're in the helo, can't do much in a helicopter actually while it's flying to a scene compared to say fixed wing asset. I guess you can kind of unbuckle and start prepping equipment. Is there any tips? We've got a lot of doctors are registered for this webinar, and I think probably quite a few are interested in retrieval. Is there any tips you'd like to give about stuff that is handy to do when you're en route to a job that is handy to sort of prep while you're moving to get there? Or do you tend to do everything beforehand, strap in and get out, depending on obviously the nature of the job?
No, I think it's a bit of a misconception that you can't really do much on the way to the job because there's so much information that comes in, so many opportunities, and obviously the longer the response time, the more time you have to actually prepare. So I mentioned already that we tend to monitor the local radio channels. For sit reps, if we don't hear information coming out, we can often prompt for that information to come to us. Part of the process is that the fire service will allocate a helicopter landing zone officer to identify a landing site for us, which may or may not be appropriate. And the final decision obviously rests with the captain of the helicopter. But we would have discussions with them on the way about our perception of the acuity and time pressures, which may actually sway us. So if the patient sounds stable and they're in the back of an ambulance, then perhaps landing at the local footy oval and having the ambulance come to us would be appropriate. If the patient's just gone into traumatic cardiac arrest as we're approaching the scene, then we don't want to land 5 minutes away. We'd probably shut the road and land on the road as close as possible to the incident. And so that obviously requires engagement of the flight crew as well as the medical team. We have the opportunity, as you'd suggested, to prepare some of our equipment. So if a patient has a significantly altered conscious state, we would probably prep intubation equipment and drugs prior to arrival to cut down our time to intubation. And then the other thing that I often encourage my team to do is to discuss who's going to do what. Now, a lot of that is often sort of predetermined, but particularly for our new medical staff who do rotate through on a regular basis, it's very useful for them to have that context of what's expected of them at the scene. And then that obviously needs to be flexible enough to meet the needs of what we find when we get to the scene, whether the patient's entrapped or free, et cetera, et cetera. And it's also a great opportunity to mentally rehearse your halo procedures as well. So if it sounds like the patient's in traumatic cardiac arrest, then having to think about your hot mnemonics for managing cardiac arrest in trauma, mentally rehearsing how to do a thoracostomy, thoracotomy, et cetera, is time not wasted and well spent And that's the sort of discussion that I tend to have with my teammates on board the aircraft. And then finally, Andy, before I hand over, I think particularly for helicopter response, we have a significant advantage in terms of developing a scene appreciation before we actually land at the scene, particularly if it's spread over a large area. And for those who've either been to or seen photos of large train crashes or heavy transport accidents, you can appreciate it would be potentially spread over a long distance, which if you're responding by road, you get a very narrow view of the scene initially, whereas a couple of circuits overhead gives us a very good appreciation of the extent of the incident, and may actually guide us towards some decision making once we're on the ground. And then
amazing,
finally, obviously, we need to think about a safe exit and approach from the aircraft and into the scene.
Yes, and that segues beautifully with the next section I'm going to talk to Paul about. Thanks so much, Dave. I think you've nailed some really important points there about spending that time productively in the air, having conversations, talking through stuff, projecting what you think may happen, some variables, what you're going to do, getting some equipment ready. Once you get into a retrieval job, you learn to pack certain items in your pockets so they're within hand's reach, and Sam will shoot me if I don't mention the flashcards that we hand out to the registrars in Care Flight NT, which we encourage them to have, or going through your protocols or guidelines if you've got digital versions on your iPads or phones or whatever while you're en route. Just do that quick mental preparation so when you land, you're cognitively ready. Just a reminder to everyone listening in, if you've got any questions, please click the Q&A tab. Some of you might have missed that at the start. We're not using the chat function. Click the Q&A, throw your questions in. They'll get moderated and popped up. So if there's any questions for Dave or anyone else, please pop them in. Thank you so much, Dave. That was amazing. We'll move on to Paul now. Paul, we're going to talk about scene assessment and patient assessment when you actually get to a trauma scene. Maybe if you could just say hi and introduce yourself quickly as well at the start, and then we'll get into it.
Great. Thanks, Andy. So I'm Paul Reeves. I'm a critical care paramedic based in Darwin, in the Northern Territory of Australia. I'm currently the principal advisor for pre-hospital care for the Department of Health. Actively still clinical, strong background in HEMS and remote work, working internationally and originally from the UK. And spent a few years in the Solomon Islands, so recognise that we have a sign in from there, Lookamoo, Solomon Islands. Okay, so I guess with, following on from Dave's chat about preparation, I think also reflecting on what we're talking about today, my main passion when approaching various different trauma-related or urgent jobs is performance, is my performance, is the team performance. And preserving and maintaining that. Dave mentioned about the checklist before you go to make sure that you're setting off on the right foot. And this is very much a dynamic thing. But one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, doesn't matter what the variety of settings are, is how well what our main role, our objective is when we first enter towards a trauma scene. And I see probably more often than not in the various different capacities how easy it is to lose our way and essentially burn time, which for a lot of patients we see not critical, but for the critical patients we deal with, it can make the difference to the quality of those outcomes. And although we focus a lot in our training with regards to medical perspectives and skills, tying that into how well we perform as an individual is key. So approaching a scene, no matter what it's like, I found that having a bit of a plan ahead of time, but understanding the overall objective, if you're going to a high acuity case, that's not going to be a treat and release at scene. You know that we are going somewhere. And I think that entering any environment or scene with an exit strategy needs to be considered right from the beginning, and trying to build that into our awareness and training and how we function and work. And, there's various different sort of cognitive scaffolds that we have out there. But in pre-hospital care, we get drawn between the dichotomy of stay and play and load and go. And I think that doesn't suit modern or contemporary pre-hospital care. And yet that's still, thrown around as that it has to be one or the other.
Can you
Time is
expand on that
critical.
a bit, Paul? Because that's such an important point that people, I think dichotomy is a perfect word. People think you're doing one or the other, but tell us about your perception and perspective on those concepts. And is it more of just a continuum that you absorb the information, the assessment, and constantly update your plan as you go? How do you think about this then?
I think it's sort of trying to uh, engage as many defaults in your practice and how you approach, how you perform. So you actually leave the cognitive ability to make the decisions and make good, fast, rapid decisions when you need to. And what I mean by that is that if we know when we go into a scene, we are already thinking about how do I exit this scene? And that being a driver, make the assumption that this is not a trauma arrest. We don't know what we get until we get to the patient side, but we have a viable time critical patient. And I sort of have a broad experience from ambulance services to HEMS and fixed wing and remote and resource limited setting. But my early time in HEMS and the aeromedical side, when I first went in, I thought I was going to do all my advanced skills all the time, and that's great. And in actual fact, helicopters are not great places for sick patients. They're noisy and they shake, and they're distracting and everything else. Their main advantage is speed over ground, and if we squander that advantage by spending an unnecessary amount of time at the scene, we're not helping and adding value to that. So the thought and feeling and the decision of the stay and play, I have a huge, bag of skills that I can deploy, comes with a huge responsibility as well. And I think that when we're making decisions on what care we need to give, that really needs to be focused on the patient. What does the patient need us to do, as opposed to what does the paramedic want to achieve? And there's little bugbears I get of sometimes, in the past you hear jobs described as good jobs and crap job, bad jobs and stuff like that. As I've gone through my years, the good jobs are the so-called bad jobs. Nobody's really badly hurt. The survival and everything else like that. The less skills I need to do, the better for the patient. But when the patient does need us to do that, then we need to do that accurately, promptly. But part of a momentum, and this is where I sort of teach and bring in the concept of the momentum mindset. And that starts with, as we walk in, who carries what gear? Where do we position? What's our mental model that we're sharing? And keep that momentum going with the decisions and the needs that need to be done. The first and foremost thing is we need to gather information about the patient, which helps us form that. And having a structured, familiar approach that we know, but we can do in the dark, so to speak. So we need to practice these things and not use them as the tool that they are, and not just become part of this automated process that we have to complete all these things in this order, and do all of our skills and then think, oh, okay, I guess we better go, type of thing. So I think, that's an important aspect. I've pulled also, came across a few years ago the concept of VUCA, which is I think originated Cold War US Army style, but to try and describe the situations that are difficult to describe. And it has a lot of applications to many other different things. And I think it actually fits really well in pre-hospital care. And VUCA, identifies volatility, uncertainty of situations, complexity, and the ambiguity. And, you know, when you're having a look at walking into a trauma scene, our environments, particularly in the pre-hospital setting, doesn't matter where the background is that we're coming from, whether flying in, driving in, we're faced with volatility. We have an uncontrolled environment. And volatility is unpredictable, it's dynamic, it can deteriorate rapidly, and so on. The information we're gathering from that setting is uncertain. And the information we're trying to piece together by looking from the outside into our patient, whether we're using a conventional primary survey, is uncertain. And then we're faced with the complexity of the things that we can see, but what about the things we can't see? And I think particularly with junior pre-hospital setting, we have a heavy reliance on the data that is presented on a screen, so the monitor. And, you know, how many, you know, from your experience, Sam and Andy and the rest of the panel here, have we had patients with severe injuries and what might be regarded as fairly unimpressive vitals initially, or that people get surprised with sudden deterioration and so on. And I think that comes back to my mindset when I'm looking at a patient, is that from even a structured system of CABC, so catastrophic hemorrhage, we deal with that before airway, but promptly airway, breathing, circulation, deformity, and exposure, is that we got to try and be able to see within the body and try and work out how bad things are and make decisions based on that. And a lot of the time, you just can't do that comprehensively, you know. And the other thing too is that the patients do not read the medical textbooks we do, and they don't behave the way the medical textbooks test us. And I think there becomes complacency that we can easily adopt because we don't see horribly critical patients every day, even in high volume units. And the additional thing with that is that we don't often have the luxury of training or going to those same cases with the same people we went to yesterday. And that's the bit that I love in HEMS units and other high performance small teams, where you do have that that higher volume of exposure, but you train a lot together. So I guess coming back to that, there's a lot that goes into that. I think that we learn well as we, you know, develop our medical knowledge, paramedicine, medicine, so on. But we rarely get the chance to practice. So we're sort of learning on the fly, and it's hugely confronting, and it's rarely never the same thing twice. So trying to adopt some structured approaches to offload some of that thinking, I think, is really important. And I think, Dave, I mean, you mentioned about the pre-department check on things like the 0-point survey, that is useful to consider self and team, and other elements like that. But the way in which training and exposure is done, I think, is hugely valuable.
On that note, Paul,
Yeah,
I'm just going to see if I can actually share. Is that popping up as a checklist on people's screens now?
Yeah,
that's good, Andy.
Yeah, so that's the checklist that Dave sent through. If you guys want to screenshot that, or you can watch it back on the recording. This is the MedStar pre-departure checklist. I think this is where systems and processes come into that, helping to cognitively offload you. That's pretty amazing. So I'll just pop that back off, and hopefully we're back onto Paul now. But yeah, that's great. Paul, look, you have such an amazing kind of perceptive philosophical approach to things. I love it. And you've mentioned some really important points there. I want to go back to one, which is that you've talked about this issue of experience, and how I think this is where medical people struggle when they come into the pre-hospital scene, is that dealing with that degree of uncertainty and volatility, and needing to sort of make decisions, whereas perhaps in the hospital environment, it's more controlled. They can fully assess the patient. They can expose them completely. They're in a big room, lots of lights, lots of people. All that's familiar is equipment. There's resources. The scanners around the corner. The ultrasound machine always works. It's right there. If it doesn't, there's another one there. How do you teach new paramedics and new doctors who are coming into this space to deal with that degree of uncertainty and accepting? I call it I coin this phrase, teaching up with care flight, is this accepting the least worst option sometimes, because sometimes none of your options are good. You just need to accept the least worst and move and keep that momentum going. Does it just come with experience and practice and training, or is there things you teach people?
I think it does, but it also comes from places like this where we are today, and those listening in. A lot of my concepts I framed by sharing experiences with experienced people, debriefing, discussing, learning from others' cases. Sam and Andy, yourself, we've had fascinating discussions, and also you've got a heavy commitment into training and education. And that's a different thing. So trying to understand why I do what I do, and that's the thing that from what we all learned here through to how we practice today hasn't come out of a book. And I would say that when I first started as a paramedic, I didn't know enough to do the job. I passed the exams, but I did not know enough how to do the job. I would still argue I don't know enough how to do the job right now. So what I try and have a look at is ways in which we can scaffold a system to try and optimize what we do to be as safe as possible, and bring that patient into a bigger group where we can try and solve the problem. And I think that again comes into, there's a lot of drama and the helicopters and the lights and everything else. It's very attractive. It's a great environment. I think you either love it or you hate it. But the adage really that it's the tip of the healthcare spear. So yeah, it's sexy, it's fancy, it's high drama and everything else, but it's just the very start, and it's part of a bigger healthcare system, all the way through, which is great. I think the talks that you're setting up here is going to, reflect on that. But teaching it is hard, and I guess that why, after you've studied med school and you're going through all of the in-place practice, development training in medicine, do you still need to do a 2-day ALS course? And it's like, well, because we have so much that goes on, and it could be so many different things that you can end up becoming paralyzed and chase around in circles, chase numbers rather than actually, the objective. And this, I think, in pre-hospital care, I do see that a lot, particularly with more junior bases, that that momentum gets lost. And what I'm talking about is that if you talk about a multi-trauma patient, so a critical patient, but a multi-trauma patient who's uncomplicated, and my definition between complicated and uncomplicated is that they're not trapped, pinned, or impaled or anchored to the earth that requires rescue, extrication, cutting out of. They literally, they meet Uber criteria. In a less developed healthcare system, they could be scooped up into the back of a car and thrown off at ED. So they're movable, and yet quite often you might see scene times of 30, 40, 50 minutes. And it's the HEMS area mentality also that comes in, is that there's other considerations. You might be limited by time on scene. Our advantage is time over ground. And we actually become more simplistic and free up our cognitive ability more so as we've become advanced. Yes, the medicine's important, the blood, the interventions and everything else. But we actually need to come back to skills that we were never originally taught. And I think there's a lot of value in the advanced practice for commencing practice in that. And I've sort of developed a model from things like that, which I'll try and share if I can here.
There you go. We're meant to have sharing enabled for presenters. If it doesn't work,
okay,
send it through to me. We'll pop it up.
I can send it through to you. But I work on a sort of a mental scaffold called OSCAR, There's a story behind that, which is for another time. And we're going to pop this into a hopefully published. But the OSCAR stands for oxygenation, stretcher, critical care interventions, anticipated problems, and then rotate wheels or blades. And the oxygenation, and I know that, at CareFlight, we talk about this, that it's not just about putting oxygen on, it's oxygenation of the vital organs, of the tissues, of the cells. And in order to progress through that, you need to stop the obvious bleeding that you've walked into, secure that airway, make sure that oxygen's going through it, and then focus on the respiratory function, the cardiac capacity, perfusion, and all other things. Make the best decision. And the other thing too is that you see in the pre-hospital setting is that everyone works around we bring the bags in, and then we empty the bags and everything's around, and we lay everything out, and it looks like a mini resus room. And it just, every piece anchors us to that place. Extrication, putting the monitor on for a person in a car really needs to come out. What value is that giving? We can take it off, we do move, and we've got to manage those risks associated with it. So getting them onto a mobile platform then keeps us now into that loop. So taking your stretcher and your means to extricate a patient from scene with you as you walk into it means that you don't have to keep running back different journeys, or that you'd start to spiral because the patient's doing something. And when it comes to critical care interventions, it is, as I said before, what does the patient need you to do? Not what would you like to achieve this shift? And those critical care interventions may not be done by you because you don't have them. So where are they next located? Early call in of aeromedical support, or a critical response car, or we don't have one, or it's not available. So the next place is ED, which is where we're going anyway. The last one after that is anticipated problems, and that's a mind towards deterioration. So when we enter a scene with a patient, we are behind the ball. The event has already happened, they're already sick, they're already injured, and they're already trying to compensate and work their socks off. We need to catch up, and ideally we would like to step ahead. So deterioration in any patient, even if their vitals look fairly okay, should not take us by surprise. And that's where it comes to, if I'm assessing a patient who, high-speed motorcycle dismount, that patient has a TBI, has a C-spine injury, has bilateral hemopneumothoraces, is bleeding from his liver, his spleen, has an unstable pelvis and long bones. And it's only when I go through the structured approach, your CABC, that you actually can either confirm or deny. But
I'm so glad you mentioned that concept, Paul, because this is something Paul said to me when we were doing some CareFlight training up north once. You were saying it to the registrars, and it was like this huge penny drop for me that you, in a major blunt trauma, a major injury situation, I love that concept of start by assuming the patient has all of the injuries, and then work your way down, and you don't have to exclude them by putting them through the CT scanner, but is there objective evidence or not of these things, and can you just tick them off your list as you go through, rather than prospectively going through trying to find the sign of the injury. Assume they've got all of them, because then that actually is a weight off your mind. Then you go, oh, assume I've got all of them. That's okay. And now I'm going to see what needs fixing, or what value I can add to this person before we move them and get them to hospital.
Absolutely. I think it becomes, these are the hazards or the pitfalls of taking a protocolized approach to our education and then applying that to the patient. Understanding, if we're trying to, confirm a tension pneumothorax, so to speak, but, we know that auscultating and hearing normal breath sounds doesn't exclude a pneumothorax. It sort of gives us some information. And I think that, that trauma patient, has a pneumothorax. I can't exclude it just because I hear bilateral air entry. What I can say is that I don't believe they are tensioning right at this point, but it doesn't mean they're good, type of thing. And I think keeping that index of suspicion and preparing for anticipated problems, And also, where are we putting them into? If you're putting them into an aluminium fuselage, there's going to be, for a longer period of time, there's a greater possibility of deterioration, and it's an environment that's less permissive than when we were before we left. So we might make decisions that we would perhaps sit on in the ED. And I think it's just, in order to make or have thoughts like that, you need to have brain space available.
Yeah.
So offload the skills as much as possible with regards to practice. Practice, we learn, we practice until we get it right, and then we get past, and then we do it for real. But how often do we practice to the point where we don't get it wrong in all the environments we're working on, and then we do it so we don't have to think about it? We're just making the decision, do we need to do it now or not? And I think these are the nuances that that bring great care to the patient and get the patient to the great places to give them the best chances of the best outcome. And we can control that, whether in a first world, highly funded, highly resourced, or whether we're remote or in a wilderness setting. I think there's a lot more we can do.
Yeah, look, that is so amazing, Paul. As we were going through this, I'm realizing we probably should have organized like a whole day conference and given you all an hour to speak on these topics. There are just so many pearls. One thing is, we would be remiss to not acknowledge the great knowledge and skill of one of the founders of pre-hospital medicine in Australia, Ken Harrison. Some of that Oscar stuff you were talking about reminded me of Ken's law of, air goes in and out, blood goes round and round.
Yeah.
Any change in that is a bad thing, and it's just that really trying to distill things down to what's important, what's the value I'm adding to this patient, and what needs addressing now, what can wait, those sorts of concepts. I think thanks so much, Paul. It was amazing. Look, we are rapidly running out of time and there's still so much to go. Gary Berkowitz, I think you're still on. Gary's at work, so he can't put his camera on, but I still did want to pick Gary's brains about a couple of things. Are you there, Gary?
And yeah, I'm still haven't been called away.
Oh,
thanks for having me on.
amazing. Yeah, great. Look, I just get you. Just a reminder to everyone dialed in. If you've got questions, click the Q&A tab, drop a question in. We'll answer it if we can. But you guys are just answering everything in advance by the sounds of it. Gary, I might just get you to introduce yourself, and then we're going to Paul touched on the entrapped patient, people that are stuck to the scene. Might get you to maybe talk about your general approach to these patients and some of the challenges and things you can do for trapped patients.
Thanks, Andy. So my name is Gary Berkowitz. I work for the Queensland Ambulance Service on the Gold Coast in the high acuity response unit, and I've got some background in flight as well. Mine's going to be much shorter. Unfortunately, the people who've come before me have laid the bar very high. I'll be dropping it significantly. So I've got quite an abridged kind of my cheat sheet to the entrapped patients, and I'll just be hitting some high points that I think about these days. I suppose the first thing I think about is that about 20 to 30% of all new cars in Australia are EVs, which is really changing the dynamic with what we are expected to respond to with regards to safety. And some practical things I think about nowadays when I'm arriving at a RTC involving electric vehicle is this thing actually off? Because unlike a internal combustion engine car, there won't be any noise. And the real risk is that this car is not yet off and it could be in drive or reverse. And as soon as someone moves their feet on or off the pedals, someone could get ridden over. So it's a real problem.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, with all the different models, there isn't a sure way to know. Some people are talking about the fire departments having a stopper which they put into the charging port. So when the car's charged, they automatically turn off. But is that available? Is that accessible? Is that in all models? There are literally models coming out every week, predominantly from China, and I don't think we've got a standard as to how to turn these things off. And then the second thing is with these lithium ion fires, we know that once they do catch fire, they're very hard to put out. And I'm always amazed at the fire department. They're standing there in all their fire retardant clothes, hopefully with a charged line or fire extinguisher. But the paramedics in the car, if it's raining, will be in like a nylon rain jacket, I think in most services. So I think there's something to be said about fire safety with all road traffic crashes, but particularly now with electric vehicles. And we probably have to look at the guidelines about what our paramedics are wearing if they're going to be in the danger zone. So these are just some kind of off the top of my head thoughts. I'm interested to get people's opinions either on the panel or online about what people are doing, what we should be doing, what best practices. So obviously when I arrived,
Well, it's only gonna become an increasing issue, though, isn't it? I mean, like you're saying, the especially with the current petrol crisis, there is just a boom in sales happening. There's huge ranges of models and things. I had not even thought of that. If someone's pinned in their car with their foot on the brake and they take it off, it might just roll, which is hard to perceive. Yeah, amazing.
yeah, it's something that look, I think EVs are probably safer than we think. I think there's some scaremongering out there. People think these things catch fire. They catch fire far less than petrol cars, which is even a small amount. But I'm more concerned about the car moving than it catching fire. But both things are a risk. So I just think, when I do approach a road traffic crash, I'm not going to go through the minutiae of what I do every time. But as often the senior medic, I will ask the fire department, which is usually signified by a helmet, but who is the senior, and identify myself as the senior medical person. And I think it's important in the beginning, before things go wrong, to identify who this person is, what their name is, and share names with them and develop a bit of a relationship. And while I will put my hands on the patient in a car, I'll quite quickly try and remove myself from that role if the patient doesn't need my skills, and stand shoulder to shoulder with the senior firefighter, and I suppose kind of orchestrate slash observe and guide the case rather than be hands-on with the patient if I don't have to do a skill skit that's in my remit. And that way I think I don't lose some 360 understanding of the scene and what's happening. A thing on safety, which I see that we don't do that well, is I don't often think we protect the patient well enough from sharp bits in the car. So I'm almost always running to the ambulance to get some sheets and towels and putting that around hard bits in the car that we've either cut or have been exposed. Because I think the fire department's very concerned with cutting the car, but oftentimes no one is protecting the patient. And I often see my role as getting a pair of safety specs for the patient, covering their head with a towel, or even a spare helmet that we have lying around and putting that on the patient, as well as making sure our crews have the right PPE on. So that's something that I always consider.
Yeah, I think
And then,
it's interesting having maybe I haven't personally actually been to a lot of primaries with people stuck in cars and bad car damage, but I've definitely stopped as a sort of good Samaritan at several car crashes, and it's amazing how easy it is to just get that tunnel vision in and fixate on the patient. And it's they're stuck in a car. There's bits of metal poking over a broken glass all over the road, and in your head you're going, I should be watching out for dangers here. But if you're not experienced in that, or you get hands-on and you start touching the person, it's very easy to quickly lose perception of just your immediate surroundings. Even anything 30 centimeters, half a meter away, it's very easy to not notice those things, isn't it?
oh, it's super easy. And also, I remember doing some rescue training, and there was a joke that was put around that don't let the patient get in the way of a good rescue. And unfortunately, more times than often, that's true. Everyone's focused on cutting the car, and don't forget there's a patient in there, guys. And one of my big things is telling the paramedics, hey, speak to them, one voice
Yeah.
consistently. What's your
Yeah.
name? Where you saw? You're going to be safe. I'm going to stay with you until you're at the hospital. I'll be with you the whole time. They need to hear that. Imagine
Oh yeah.
being in a crash and then being trapped in that crash. It's got to be terrifying.
Oh, and it's easy, and the patients are often actually really distressed and in pain, screaming, crying. It's just been a huge shock that's happened to them. I think it's just super important, that calm, consistent reassurance. Paul, you popped your hand up there.
Yeah, no, that just draw attention to, out of the UK has been some fascinating work and research that's been done, Tim Nutby and his team, on the management of trapped patients and challenging the paradigms. But the supporting the patient and the patient experience was really prominent in that. So that's Exit Project. Have a look at that. But yeah.
For those that don't know, he's doing a lot of work around the self-extrication stuff at the moment as well. I think he's putting a lot of stuff online about that too, which is great. Thanks. And Dave, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Just to build on what Gary's been saying, I've had similar experiences, and I think it's very easy to get caught up in the extrication process and particularly as critical care teams, that's something that I think we often forget that the other clinicians and rescuers at the scene probably do it far more than what we do. We should be planning and preparing to do the interventions that are unique to us, and leave the other stuff to the people who do it probably far more far more frequently and better than what we do. I've flicked another aid memoir through to you.
Oh yeah, I'm
Excuse me.
just getting that up now.
Which is an aid memoir that's been put together by SA Ambulance. There's been a lot of work done in South Australia between ambulance and the fire rescue services, and also nationally through groups such as Arrow. But the thing that I particularly wanted to point out was the concept of tempo, and the common terminology that's now being introduced around setting the tempo for the extrication, which ties in really nicely with what Paul was talking about and the work that Tim's been doing, because self-extrication is a valid extrication technique, but there is so much terminology that's been bandied about, which can often be really confusing amongst different craft groups. So having this standardized terminology around what is the tempo required for the extrication of this patient based on their condition or potential condition, I think is really critical.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and Paul, and Dan Warner. Shout out to Dan. Hi, Dan. Has popped a link in the Q&A there with foundation training course for approach to EV incidents, run by New South Wales TAFE. So there's courses you can do now. That's great. Anyway, back to you, Gary. So we've touched on EVs. We've touched about the scene awareness, maintaining situational awareness, 360 access. Any other hot tips about the entrapped patients?
Oh, look, I think I'll run through a quick summary of some things I think about. How many cars, how many patients, which cars do the patients come from, and don't always focus on the entrapped patients. I remember doing once a good smash with 2 entrapped patients, and the girlfriend was sitting outside the car, and she was wearing all black, and I came up to her and said, I don't mean to be funny, but are you a goth? Because she was so pale, and it turned out she was the sick one. She had a large splenic bleed, and the entrapped patients just had lower leg injuries. I often look for the quiet patient who's outside the car when I'm with entrapped patients, because they might often be the sickest ones.
Yeah.
And then look, when I started this in the last millennium, as I like to tell the paramedic students, in 1999, we were using Kendrick extrication devices, and no one was allowed to move, and we were doing standing takedowns. If you know what that is, you're as old as I am. And I'm glad to say now that we cut the car away from the patients, and if the patient can get out the car, let them get out the car. So there's been good work by Rob Fenwick from the Resus Room podcast about, I think Dave alluded to it, let the patient self-extricate if they can. And if they're not, then we need to get stuck in. But I don't think we need to be as concerned as we were in the past about zero movement of the C-spine. Patients will move less on their own accord than us trying to get them out the car. So those are, when it comes to the critically unwell patient in the car, my general rule is if there's a problem to the primary survey and I can't fix it, I'm going to say something to the terms of, I need to the senior firefighter, we need to get them out the car right now, and I need you to pretend like the car's on fire. So I need to give them authority to hurt the patient to get them out. So I'm talking about the patient who has an uncontrolled hemorrhage, a unclear airway that we can't remedy with suction, or a significant breathing problem. Like if we're thinking about bagging a patient in a car, placing pneumo darts in the car, this is the kind of patient who I'm probably going to tell to the senior firefighter, if you think about this, I need to get this guy out so quickly that it's the same as if the car was on fire. That's the kind of speed and urgency I get, because there's no point getting him out with a perfect C-spine or having some residual pain if he's not alive to talk about it. I like that idea of tempo, but I kind of obviously do a graded assertiveness, and I find if you have introduced yourself to the senior firefighter on arrival, that relationship's hopefully there to for them to respond to your actions later on.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy to have. That's kind of the top point of your graded assertiveness pyramid. It's the fire. Imagine this thing is on fire. We got to move now. And I think, it is amazing how that even seemingly complex extrications can suddenly be made quite quick with the right, as long as the guys have the right equipment there and to cut stuff, they can chop up cars and open them like tin cans fairly quickly nowadays.
Yeah, and most of the time, obviously, there's always, we do get these cases where someone's rolled up against a tree and the only access is really like the undercarriage of the car. And there are those ones that sometimes do necessitate an amputation. They're very rare. I think this is my 27th year now in EMS, and I've done 2 on-site amputations. I will say that the training or the exposure to it, I think everyone thinks about, it's the exposure is limited, and when you do it, almost always the limb is up against something, if not completely encapsulated in something, in a dark box, and like the training needs to correspond to that. This isn't just, okay, you've got great access to the limb, put the giggly saw on. There's a good chance you're going to drop the wire. There's a good chance that your glove is going to get snagged up against something metal. And I think we have to be reasonable and have to consider sometimes thinking outside the box with these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is funny, isn't it? Some of these procedures you talk about halo. This is the ultimate low occurrence, maybe once in a career, twice in a career type procedure. It is hard to stay up to date. And then, like you said, you suddenly find yourself going, this is very different to the nice big flat table in the well-lit room with the pig carcass that I practiced the jiggly saw with a couple of other people and plenty of time. It's it can be quite different. It's a really important point about contextualizing your training, isn't it, to fit the environment.
To fit that, and I think a really significant thing, certainly in my practice, is consultation with our HaRU doctors who are online, our senior medical officers, for them to get the understanding of what you're battling with, and have that other person provide advice so you don't lose context of, is this actually going to benefit the patient, or are they too far gone where we're just going to cause a moral injury to those on scene and ourselves. There is an element where putting other rescuers in that position to perform an amputation for someone who is unlikely going to survive it at that point has to be weighed up to the benefit and the harm to that patient as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that I think these days we're potentially more aware of, but you still might find yourself in situations where a lot of these first responders, as Dave mentioned, sometimes they're volunteers, lay people that work for the SES or similar services, and they do see some confronting stuff in their roles. But I think, it's important to keep that in mind, isn't it, before you barrel in. And I think it comes back to Paul's point about value. Is this actually adding value here? Look, that's amazing, Gary. And I don't know that I actually got you to introduce yourself properly. It would take a whole hour for Gary to reel off all his decades of experience. And many of you dialed in online know Gary. So again, we're clocking an hour now, and I'm conscious we've still got a couple of people I want to get some insights from. Is there anything else you wanted to add in, Gary? Thank you so much for sharing.
Not at all. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Unreal. Yeah, if you got to go, you get a job, bail out. Thanks so much, man. That was awesome. Great. I think that ties in now, sort of talking about critical care procedures and things. I was going to get Libby, if she hasn't fallen asleep after a night shift, to jump on now and talk about some of these advances we've seen in pre-hospital trauma care over the last decade or two. There has been such an expansion in not just research, but practice, and how that's translated into practice in the pre-hospital scene, to the point where I sort of quote this on the ETM course quite often, that patients arrive now partly or wholly resuscitated. And for us in hospital, that throws in new challenges about receiving patients who we aren't starting from scratch with. They've often had a lot of life-saving procedures done, and I think touches back to Paul's point as well, sometimes maybe not done, but with good justification. And Libby, perhaps if you could jump in now and introduce yourself and tell us about some of the big critical care changes or advances you've seen over your career.
Hi, everybody. I'm Libby. I am 25 years today with New South Wales Ambulance. Yeah, so I was in the daggy blue overalls 25 years ago. I don't know if I've got much more idea or, confidence in my abilities from back then to now, because the more you know, the more you realise you don't know. And 13 years of that have been on the aircraft operating out of Sydney Metro, but obviously we cover the state. I think obviously this is not my area of expertise in terms of what has changed. So I'll just talk to me working in my role. What have I seen change? And obviously we've had the professionalism of paramedicine. And I think with that, we've seen sort of this term pre-hospital starting to change to out of hospital. And it's this, I think that's given paramedicine as well as, pre-hospital, out of hospital care permission to say that what we do out of hospital is probably just as important as what happens in hospital. There's a lot of optics and there's a lot of psychology that goes with that. And you can see that the actual education that's available to paramedics and doctors alike, and our other, health professionals to provide care in this out of hospital environment is like it is so much more than what it was when I started 25 years ago. There's, postgraduate courses saying that, this out of hospital care justifies a course specific to X, because we know that the care that we provide in this out of hospital environment is really worthwhile. Off the back of that, it's also, I think, given hospitals, it's given us permission to do stuff in the out of hospital environment where hospitals now have to trust what we're telling them, and they have to trust that what we're bringing in is X, and they need to mount a response that is actually worthy of what we're telling them. I think there used to be a bit of a disconnect there where we would tell them something and they'd go, well, we'll meet you in the hallway and we'll see for ourselves, and then we'll mount the response that we want to mount. And so, what have we seen? We've seen as a result of, the, mung beans and what have you that I'm just talking about in that change of terminology, we've seen an impressive streamlining of things that we thought were good for the patient in this out of hospital environment be really streamlined. There's an independent body of knowledge. There's research supporting what we do. And the things that we thought were okay, a lot of them are the same, but we just do them better and we do them in a more timely fashion, and there's more evidence supporting them. And I'll touch on what Paul talked about, this load and go notion versus stay and play. Like load and go was sort of like, we're not going to do anything because we can't offer the patient anything, let's go, versus stay and play. And it's like, oh yeah, you're just choosing to stay and play. And I think both those phrases really, they don't fit, because it's not what we do. If we're choosing to do a minimal amount for the patient, it's because we're choosing to do that, and there's good evidence to suggest that what we can do in the out of hospital environment is not worthy of us doing it, and we're going to go. And then if we're staying and we're choosing to do an intervention, it's because it's life or limb saving. And I think there's such a beautiful body of knowledge and evidence around what those are. So if I was to sort of talk about what I think we've really streamlined, it would be video laryngoscopy. We've been doing RSIs for a long time, but I think just this sort of, everyone's now doing video laryngoscopy. I shouldn't say everyone, the majority are now doing video laryngoscopy. And what has that brought about? That's brought about, firstly, the doctors are less stressed when the paramedic's doing the tube because they can see what's going on. But what it's brought about is probably a beautiful education piece at the time of the intervention, but also building this enormous bank of amazing airway videos that the whole of, critical care can benefit from. The thing that I've seen around RSIs and the sort of airway management stuff in New South Wales is that there's been a huge piece around not only intensive care paramedics doing their job better prior to our arrival, but also what do we need to expedite the next phase of that patient's care in terms of securing an advanced airway. And we have this really streamlined sort of, we need 2 lines. We want the patient on a bed. We want a platform to put all of our equipment on. And you turn up to these patients where you're just like, oh, okay, I really have 5% of the job left to do, and you can do it in minutes. And it's really beautiful. Ultrasound.
There's a lot to be said for that sort of standardization, isn't it, of those things across services now.
Yep, and I think that Paul touched on it. You know, that's that cognitive offload where you have a standard approach and you have these assumptions that it's all going to be present, like whether it's, you know, an actual approach to a particular mechanism of injury, and then you're choosing to exclude doing something or choosing to rule out something. And the cognitive offload for that is because you've got this beautiful foundation to start from, rather than just trying to pluck from thin air like, oh, could it be this? Could it be that? You've got a framework to start with, and you're crossing things off going, nah. And I think that then gives us more headspace to actually do the medicine and the thinking and the trickier stuff that comes with years of exposure and more learning. But at least you as a crew have got a foundation and a common knowledge and a common language that you're working from.
And I think you touched on something there as well about things like, you know, recording your video laryngoscopy and using that for audit and QA and that sort of stuff is also just, it's so incredibly valuable, that resource, isn't it, to tie that back into your quality systems and your education as well. It's a great learning loop.
Yep. And I think ultrasound would be a very, very similar thing. You know, we've always been doing a bit of ultrasound, but now, particularly in New South Wales, there's a standard teaching process. There's a standard patient approach as to how you approach your EFASTs. There's been an expansion of how you use it in the context of gaining access for patients. And I think just having that really standard approach and that minimum standard of training, it just means that we can do it now, and it can be effective, and it can be effective in a timely manner. And so it's all of that is benefiting and justifying that this out of hospital care that we provide is good stuff now. It's not just, well, we think it might be good and we're sort of massaging in hospital care and applying it to this out of hospital world where we think it's good. It's like, no, we've actually got some good data to say, yeah, keep doing it, but let's do it in this streamlined sort of standard approach. And then that opens up the cognitive headspace, as I say, to then apply it to that particular patient. Ventilators, thank you, COVID. Hamilton. it's a good ventilator.
Oh, the Oxylog was all right, wasn't it?
Amazing. Everyone loved it.
Hamiltons are incredible.
You marry that with the crowd pleaser defibrillator, and we've got an amazing rom-com, you know, sort of HBO series. You know, I think the Hamilton really has revolutionized what we can deliver to the patients, but also I think because we've got a better ventilator, there's a reason to be better educated, and there's a reason to have a better understanding of ventilation strategies, because we can actually do it with the ventilator that we've got. And it applies to your trauma, your inter-hospital patients, your DSI patients. It's actually the equipment that's driven probably the education piece across the board, as opposed to the education piece saying, oh, hang on, we probably need a better piece of kit to actually achieve that. And I think that COVID is probably how we got there. Statewide dispatch and referral, I think that has been an amazing thing. And there are still, a few pockets where that doesn't happen in New South Wales. But I think that overarching view of how things happen, how things are referred, how things are dispatched, patients are benefiting. And that's obviously big picture stuff. If we talk about blood, we've always carried some blood, but obviously we've had the introduction of ELP. But a huge thing that I've seen change is the blood network within New South Wales, and it's incredible. You can have as much blood as you want, as much blood as you can get your hands on in moments in crazy tiny towns. The way with which this system has been set up to support these rural and remote communities, and for us to be able to access it and have it brought either to scene or for us to pick it up is quite remarkable, and it's making change, and it's awesome, and it's exciting. Like, it's pretty cool, you know, like landing into a tiny hospital, you know, you run out under a hot disc and you pick up your next lot of blood, and you just think, I don't think I'd get this patient to that definitive care if this wasn't part of the system. And that's been really cool. TXA and calcium, you know, fits into that same wheelhouse. In summary of all of that, I think big things that I think are globally making, and this is the world per Libby, so take it with a grain of salt, that are globally making big changes to patient outcomes, is that because we're now kind of trusted, and you touched on it, Andy, with the care that we do in this out-of-hospital environment, hospitals are having to mount pretty impressive responses to keep that care going. And I love the hospital network buzzwords: Code Crimson, RTP, you know, all of your stroke referrals, all of your AMI referrals. And they're just these buzzwords that internal hospital systems have been able to refine what that means. And you turn up to just an incredible workhouse of, there are moments where you feel proud to live in Australia. And I know that not everyone on here is from Australia, but I can only talk to what I see. And you just think, this patient was in the middle of a paddock 4 hours from civilization, an hour and 20 minutes ago, and we've given them world-class hospital grade care in the field, and we're now arriving at a hospital an hour and 20 minutes later. And when I say 4 hours, you know, that would have been the drive. And the hospital is mounting this incredible reception because we've been able to use this known language that means, I've got a really sick patient and they trust you. And it is quite remarkable. And you know, the mung bean side of me could get emotional about it. It's really cool stuff. So in the interest of time, that's my summary of what I've seen change.
That is such an amazing summary. Thank you, Libby. And we can't let you say any of that without acknowledging the role that each of our panelists has had today in boosting the professionalism and integrity and quality and structure of the, I have to change my phrase, out of hospital care system in Australia now, not pre-hospital, out of hospital care, because you've all been in this system for so long and overseen that change and brought that degree of expertise and professionalism to us in the hospitals. And that has really, I think you've really nailed it there. Number one is trust. It's built that trust with the degree of professionalism that all of you and all of your out of hospital colleagues have brought to the game of pre-hospital care in Australia. But I think it's really forced the hospital systems to adapt and meet you at the door with a better response, and it's probably actually driven us to up our game a bit and in hospital to make sure we have an appropriately professional and expert-led reception for these patients, because you guys are doing such amazing work in that scene. Cool. Thanks, Libby. Look, in the interest of time, Sam, we always do this. We talked a lot. We got the last 10 minutes. Might try and keep it at 8 so we can just thank everyone properly at the end. I don't know if Sam Bendall actually needs an introduction. You can just introduce yourself quickly to everyone. Unmute, say hi, tell everyone who you are. If there's any final questions, thanks for the comments, everyone. Throw them in the Q&A section there. And Sam's going to talk to us just about this concept of distance and time pre-hospital, which Libby kind of touched on. There's these patients that have very long scene times and long travel times, and that is contrasted drastically with some of the work you do, Sam, in Sydney with the rapid response crews, where the time from the notification, the launch, the arrival, the scene time, the treatment, the packaging, the loading, and the trip to hospital is sometimes quicker than other services can just get out the door to some of these longer jobs. So maybe you can tell us what you think some of the big differences are for clinicians working in these different environments. Tell everyone who you are first.
Hi everyone, it's lovely to meet you all. And I know we'll definitely preface this by saying it's just, it's such a privilege to be on this with a whole bunch of people that I've learned a huge amount from and continue to learn a huge amount from over the years. So I am Sam. I am an emergency physician by trade and a retrieval specialist for about 18 plus years. I'm the Director of Education for CareFlight which across the NT in New South Wales, and we do both internal and external stuff, and I'm very, very lucky to have worked with Andy and Paul in that capacity. I work clinically as a retrieval specialist through CareFlight for New South Wales Ambulance with Lib, so we spend lots of time together, which is awesome, and again have learned an enormous amount from her, particularly the way she communicates, as you all have just seen. I work as a statewide retrieval consultant. And for those people in New Zealand, I worked for a year in New Zealand. I'm actually a Kiwi, as you can hear. And Andy saved me till last because I talk faster than anyone else on the planet. Worked for and I continue to be involved in what is now Northern Rescue here, which is why I'm here in New Zealand at the moment. So in my role as the Director of Education, I think education and operations are, as we all know, intricately intertwined. And when you think of the contrast between a rapid launch service and I guess one that has a longer remit time, they are quite different, but also quite similar. So just to give you some context, is in CareFlight at Westmead in Sydney, we have an easy 8145 helicopter, and the average launch time is about 3 minutes from time of phone call. Our average flight time is under 10 minutes, and so we access our patients very rapidly. And for that reason, that sort of dictates some of our mission profile. It's mainly pre-hospital trauma, but we also go to some pediatric critical illness. So, for example, severe asthma, you see, is that sort of stuff, simply because we get there quickly. We work mainly Sydney Basin only, and where that service came from, we had a service that evolved from the head injury retrieval trial, and then into a more a more sort of multi-role service, but not multi-role in the same way that the service that Lib and I work in. So it's Sydney Basin only. It is pre-hospital only, with the very occasional secondary thrown in, which means that we can tailor our processes, our equipment, and our training very much to the profile of patient that we'd likely to see. And whilst they might be 0 to 100 in age, it's a smaller profile of critical injury and illness that we're likely to see, and way sooner in the time that patient's journey than we would otherwise. We also, clinically, I work with Lib. We work in a multi-role helicopter fixed wing and road service across New South Wales. So again, we go to primaries, 2,000 of our workers into hospital across the state and across multi-platform, and lots of different platforms, which takes a different kind of mindset and planning. And whilst we can preload a lot of the stuff that we can do and train, as Lib talked about, there's also, particularly for the more complex missions, maybe the rescue type missions, watched Lib the other day plan for somebody who was lost recently, and the complexity of the planning is real and very necessary to stop us going out the door without the necessary planning and preparation. And in the Northern Territory is completely different. So in the Northern Territory, we serve a large Indigenous population. In New South Wales, we say, well, look, there's always another way of achieving that. And that definitely came out of a colleague of ours at the death of Nick Wilson, out of our colleague, our friends and paramedics who died in a winching accident. And the mantra for us has always been, there's always another way since then to preserve our safety. Now, in the Northern Territory, that's actually not the case. So this is where things start to get a little bit different. The availability of a road ambulance anywhere outside Darwin and Katherine is extremely limited. And so if there's no plane, that patient's not getting to definitive care, full stop. And this is where where things start to become more grey than they are certainly in the sort of more urban kind of environments, or the environments where road resources are in greater supply. And so so how do we plan for this? When we end up in the Northern Territory, remember we have different seasons up there. So wet season is very different to dry season. The mission profiles are different. There's many more illnesses, or what we call hospital primaries, where the teams are typically going out to a clinic which may be staffed by a remote area nurse who may be of varying experience. Some of them are amazing and have been there for 4 million years. Others, have less experience, but it's always a resource poor environment compared to the complexity of what they have to deal with. We have some information from the scene, but not always, but not comprehensive handover sometimes, and the ability for the clinicians on the ground to deliver the sort of care that we might be able to start in a peripheral hospital, maybe in New South Wales, is much more limited. And patients are sicker, the baseline is sicker. So what we need to be able to do, our crews need to be able to do, is plan and prepare for everything. And I think Paul and Dave both spoke about the need to go there mentally. And I think we have this great poster up in Rapid Response that says, don't go where your mind hasn't already been. So how do we just to sort of bring it all together in the interest of time, how do we plan for this? Well, there's a bunch of stuff that we teach our all of our clinicians in terms of the way that we think, and I think Lib touched on this. Andy, I'm not sure if you're able to put up the same team paradigm here, please. It's so when the core of our training is getting our teams, whether you're working on rapid response and you're out the door in 3 minutes seeing pre-hospital trauma, where it may be appropriate to do a thoracotomy because you're not too far from a trauma hospital, or you're going out to Borroloola, which is 2 hours flight away, to a critically unwell patient there who's going to choose, realistically, time to definitive care is another 3 to 4 hours. So this is the same team cognitive framework that we've come up with, and this is not a protocol, it's or a recipe. It's basically like a mystery box. It's if you look, anyone who watches MasterChef. So here is all the ingredients that may go into your cake, but you need to consider each of them. But it's up to you to bake the cake at the time based on what's going on. And so for example, if for a penetrating trauma patient in rapid response, we'll definitely do scene safety and situational awareness. We'll get a bit of a handover, or we may have to stage if there's still an active threat there, so we may be a delay to accessing our patient, but actually we may take one look at them and say, what, we're going to put the ultrasound probe on. If they've got tamponade, we're just going to put a line in on there and just get moving. We're not so our meaningful interventions will be low. They will mean basically get in and drive. Now, in the Northern Territory, that may be very different. We may take a different approach where we're going to do definitely scene safety and situational awareness. And with the increased unrest up there, that's become incredibly important. But we may do things, we may do some things or do all of them, but they may not necessarily be in that order. The other way that we train people to work in either context, whether it's a rapid response context or if it's working in a resource poor environment. Can you put the next one up, please, Andy?
Did that last one come up for you, Sam?
Yes,
Did you see the same team picture?
I've got the same team.
Oh, cool. Yeah. All right. That's all right. Dave just got a white screen. That's okay. Sorry, Dave. We'll put the next one up.
Yeah. Didn't anyone else? There.
That should be popping up. Can you see that one?
No one else can see it. Okay, so it's basically a picture of a mud map where and what this is about, making the unfamiliar familiar. And so what we, in terms of we're basically put things here and do the same way every single time. So we teach all of our clinical crews, whether you're in rapid response or you're going out in the middle of nowhere on a fixed wing, and we may have, and in terms of the long fixed wing things, we may have multi-stage approaches where sometimes the patient's accessed by helicopter, sometimes and then they will meet the fixed wing to fly them back to Darwin. So there are multiple elements in every patient's journey when you think of these longer teams. But what we can do is reduce the cognitive load by making the unfamiliar familiar. And this is the idea of the way that we train people here, is to focus on the critical decision making as a team, to focus on making the unfamiliar familiar, and train as much as we can so that 70% of the cognitive load is taken out of what you do, and then it frees up your cognitive bandwidth to be able to focus on the differences in the mission profile that you're going to go to. So these are just some examples about how, when you've got these different mission profiles, how you manage to do these things in a standardized and safe and organized way, with everybody having a shared mental model. Other things, we do the in-teams jobs up in the Northern Territory, so that's taking patients from 0 to 100 and a lot of little babies down to the Adelaide Children's Hospital. For definitive care. And these are very challenging missions as well. They're very long, so flight times are about 4 hours. So you just have to think about fit for purpose equipment. You have to think about redundancy. You have to think about, have you got enough stuff? And you have to really plan and prepare for every eventuality. And I think this serves anyone in critical care well. Then that kind of mindset. If this patient arrests, what am I going to do? And do I have the stuff? And are we on the same page? If the patient has, stops breathing, what am I going to do? I've got, if this, then that. that. So we plan ahead for every contingency, and we make sure that we've got the right equipment and the right redundancy, built into the system. So obviously we need to do less of that if there's than that in the short pre-hospital setting, but it still applies. So I think what I'd love to get across is whilst the profiles of the missions are very different, there is some underpinning foundational stuff which makes us safe to operate in different environments. And then the challenges, I guess, of the rural and remote and the longer challenges are really the complexity in mission planning, making sure you've got the right equipment, the right staff. Fatigue becomes a real thing, and obviously staff safety with respect to the environment and some of the I guess the situations that you've got to go into, where maybe in Sydney we might have a whole bunch of police, but this police have to fly in by fixing as well. So maybe we're going into slightly something more volatile. And how do you manage to keep our staff safe and stage them if we can, but sometimes that's not as possible as we think. So there's this bit of reality versus, I guess, what we would like to do. It goes back to what Andy said about our least worst option, which is, I think, our favourite saying. Thank you. No, that's not.
Amazing. So you back a lot into a few minutes there. There's so many things I could pull out to dissect it, drill down. That was the most concise, rapid explanation of the differences in missions that people find themselves on. And I think this, we're talking about our own personal experience between Sydney and the NT, and I lived and worked in the NT, and I still go and do the teaching up there with Sam and the rest of the amazing care flight team that work up there full time. But this, I think, this all equally applies to places like Western Australia with these vast distances. Queensland also, second largest state, very long travel times. And I think those points you've made about, and apologies for if you couldn't see the screen share that I did. I don't know why that wasn't showing up. I'll pop them into the recording. Hopefully we can put them on the website so you can see the things that Sam's talking about. That little touching back on, I think this ties in nicely back to the start about Dave's points about preparation, walking out the door, doing your checklist, thinking ahead, visualization. That little bit of time spent at the start can pay off in spades down the track in your mission, because there's nothing worse than getting somewhere and going, oh, I forgot the X because we didn't think ahead enough, or we didn't use the checklist. And Sam and the rest of the Sydney Care Flight team have done an amazing amount of work on their resources here. And I think most pre-hospital services around the country now are doing similar things to try and standardize things and give people these cognitive aids and things to assist you in those missions. And I think it equally applies to the very short ones because they're very time pressured, as well as the long ones where you've just got an extended amount of time, and you don't want to be 2 hours from home and realize you've forgotten something. And Sam, look, I think you did touch on a point there as well about bring this back to the patient, that different contact time that you have, that you're seeing the physiology in a much more new situation in these rapid response jobs, which again is something we're very unfamiliar with in hospital. And I think it's something as well as the doctor, when you pull over and you stop at a car crash that's just happened, that's a totally foreign scene for most of us. You're seeing injuries and physiology so soon after the impact of the injury that it can be hard to interpret sometimes, can't it? And pick where things are going to go. Whereas, people say this word survivor bias. I don't know if there's a true thing, but when you're these more extended jobs, the longer the patient's been waiting for you to get there, for some help to get there, they'll be in a different state. And we've had incidents up in the NT where there's been people driving their car off the road into the trees and not been found for 6, 8, 12 hours sometimes. And then they have thermal impacts on their body and all these other things that you might not think of. So I think, you've touched on some amazing points there as well about the interstate and the jet jobs as well, and the differences those assets can have to your approach. Amazing. Look, thank you so much, everyone. Look, in the interest of time, like I said, I didn't realize this was going to be such a big event. We've had up to about 280 people dialed in at one point, which is a fraction of about not quite half of the people that register, but there's a lot of people contacted us to want to access this who couldn't attend today, wanted to access it online afterwards. So we'll definitely make this available. Thank you to everyone for your comments and questions in the post, and shout out to John Rowe up in the NT. Hi, Rowie, hope you're doing well. Thanks for the comments, and Dan and Lisa, Tom, and Jeff, Dan, Jess again, everyone else that commented. Thank you so much. Dave, Libby, Gary, Paul, Sam, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, I think we've just lifted the lid on your expertise here. We didn't even get to dive into deeply. We may now have to launch an ETM pre-hospital conference day or something, I think, to get you guys actually share more of your experience. It's so valuable. I really wanted to get this out to share it with the wider trauma community. International guests, thank you also for signing in. I hope there's still a few of them online, and I hope you can take some lessons and learnings. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have specific questions for the speakers. We can put you in touch with them if you want to access any of their resources or knowledge or skills, or you want to share information. That's mainly what this is about. It's about sharing knowledge and information around the country and around the world. So look, if no one's got anything else to add, I think we're going to wrap it up there. The recording will be available. It will get sent out to anyone who's registered, and then we're going to make it available on the ETM website soon. And I think, speakers, if you could just stay on quickly at the end, I think we'll keep you on. Everyone else, thank you so much for attending. Shout out to you all, and we'll see you at the next ETM webinar. Thanks so much for tuning into the ETM podcast. Thanks again to Dave, Paul, Gary, Libby and Sam for sharing their deep and insightful perspectives on pre-hospital trauma care, or should we now say out-of-hospital trauma care. If you treat injured patients in the emergency department and you haven't done the ETM course, you need to do it. We have places still available on courses this year, and you can find out all the details at etmcourse.com. If you're a PEDS person and you want to learn how to treat seriously injured children, you can sign up for the Pediatric Trauma Management course, or PTM course. Details also available on our website, and hot tip, this course is selling out fast, so get in quick. If you've done ETM or PTM and you want to take your trauma skills up a notch, you can check out the ETM Advanced course, our new 2-day course designed to take things up a notch from ETM. On the Advanced course, we cover pediatric, geriatric and obstetric trauma, as well as advanced management of traumatic cardiac arrest, including in all 3 of these patient groups. Lastly, if you are interested in doing some online learning, you can check out the Tox course at etmonline.com, where we have 4 modules of emergency toxicology and a 5th coming soon, including our most recent Module 4, Bites, Stings and Envenomation, starring world-renowned Australian toxicologist Dr. Jeff Isbister. And you can also register your interest for our upcoming procedural sedation course, which will hopefully be out by mid-year. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode.